Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. Today we're going to take a long, hard look at one of my favorite casual decks, one I've talked about a little bit before, because while building new decks is incredibly fun, tuning and tweaking one of your favorite decks to get to perform just how you want can be just as rewarding. And frankly, it's something that's not covered nearly as much on a lot of other channels that I've seen. And if you want to do some tweaking, be sure to check out Commander Cookout Media Group's sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com. They're your source for all your gaming needs. This holiday season, there's a lot of good stuff to potentially pick up. Even Foundations, this super core set that's come out this November, has kind of a lot of interesting sleepers. I've been picking up a lot of the new Foundations Jumpstart packs, kind of just for funsies, and I've been pleasantly surprised by some of the mono-colored legends that they've stuffed in there. There's some intriguing brewing to be doing. I love low-color decks in general. You can pick those up and other things and you can pick up Jumpstart cards as well as any other gaming needs you may have at FusionGamingOnline.com. They're your source for all your gaming needs. Fusion sponsors many of the projects here on Commander Cookout Media Group, including Commander Cookout, including CAD-Pop, Commander History, Sidewalk Slam, and, lest we forget, Curbside Pickups and Commander Munchies. Be sure to check out everything on the channel, and if you are enjoying it, go ahead and give a like and a comment. A subscribe goes a long way. But let's get started with today's episode. There's going to be some interesting stuff to cover. I'm describing this episode and this project as trying to interrogate a deck. This is a deck that I've been playing for a while, basically ever since Adventures in the Forgotten Realms came out. I've played Trelasarra, Moondancer so many times that I really feel confident knowing exactly how I want its game plan to play out. So my goal is to interrogate the deck, find cards that fit into this game plan, and supplement them with additional supporting effects that are going to help, while I remove cards that don't gel with that game plan, and find ways to answer threats to that game plan that my opponents are going to present. My deck, which you can find the current deck list for down in the description, or I guess the before, is centered around the commander Trelasarra Moondancer, a white and a green for a legendary creature elf cleric with whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Trelasarra and scry 1. As I've already said, this is a pretty sweet deck and one that I've played around a lot. It's come with me to just about every Commander-exclusive event since the card was released. So I've learned what game plan it wants. Before we get to that though, let's briefly review the 3 stages of the game as we talk about them here on Gemstone Mine. They use the mnemonic ready, set, go. Getting ready is the first stage of the game, where the goal is to amass resources so that you're in a position to multi-spell during stage 2, the middle stage of the game all set up. This is usually the longest stage of most games of Commander, and this is where you're in a position to multi-spell. Going for it is the end game, where you're putting your opponents on the clock and trying to win. cEDH sees its biggest divergence from casual Commander in stages 1 and 3, where the going for it stage of the game is usually going to include a combo that just threatens to win on the spot, while the first getting ready stage of the game tends to be over very quickly, as players are rapidly accruing broken mana rocks and other fast mana sources in order to be ready to get their game plan online, usually as soon as turn 2 or turn 3. Trelasarra is not a cEDH deck, but I want to inform it with some of the things I've learned playing cEDH. Trelasarra generally uses turns 1 and 2 for getting ready, kind of like a cEDH deck, but what it wants to do is cast Trelasarra on turn 2, and then immediately get a life gain trigger to start controlling our top deck scries for the rest of the game. This means that turn 3 marks when we're usually all set up, starting to apply gentle pressure with attacks while adding in value engines to take advantage of card selection from scries. Trelasarra gets big pretty fast, but without evasion, we usually won't be going for it until after turns 5 or 6. And as an aside, part of the reason why I really like Trelasarra so much for blind convention games is that I can usually use scries to pass on the deck's win conditions if it feels like it's too early to start going for it, because other players are playing a slower deck, or just they're enjoying the grind. On the other hand, if people are throwing early haymakers, I can absolutely speed up, scry past the grind engines, and find evasion to start threatening knockouts of my own. With our game plan in mind, we can start interrogating our card choices. And again, I'm going to start by looking at that before deck list. Trelasarra is an ideal choice for this because we're choosing to run very little in the way of ramp. We can look very closely at our mana curve. We want a life gain trigger on turn number 2, the turn we play Trelasarra. And to accomplish this, we generally want a Soul Sister, a class of cards which offer life gain whenever a creature ETBs. The classics for this are whenever a creature ETBs on any side of the table. Soul Warden, Soul's Attendant, these are the classics, as well as the color-shifted version in Essence Warden, meaning that as our opponents are playing out their game plan, and we play creatures, and they play creatures, we are getting many more scries, and we're pumping up our commander. These are the optimal turn 1 play. However, there's not a density. 3 does not a reliable combo make. Newer Soul Sisters like Lunarch Veteran and Guide of Souls only trigger when creatures enter under our control, which still makes our initial game plan of the getting ready stage of the game work, so I want to look at other effects which fit into this vein to get a critical mass of 1 mana value Soul Sisters. There are also a couple of other effects which only trigger on our opponent's casting creatures, cards like Authority of the Consuls, which I really do want for the Kismet effect anyway. It's something that I have less controlled when I'm going to see the life gain triggers, but I still think I would keep it in over something like a Johnny's Welcome. Any deck that's trying to pursue an aggressive game plan with a beatdown probably wants, if possible, to have access to Kismet effects, especially if they're in white. Having blockers come into play tapped can be the difference between victory and defeat, and it allows you to really out-tempo and pressure your opponents down. While I'm doing this interrogation, I want to look for other 1 mana value cards which have this effect. If you look at the deck list, the only ramp we're running are cards which let us ramp on turn 1 and then cast a Soul Sister and Trelasarra on turn 2. That means we probably need to produce green, white, white on turn number 2, which usually means that traditional dorks like Llanowar Elves don't fit the bill. Yes, we could potentially have Essence Warden as the Soul Sister in hand, but frankly, we're much better off if we can produce that white mana because most of our Soul Sisters require a single white hit to cast. So that means we want cards like Avacyn's Pilgrim and Birds of Paradise, which can tap for white. We need them to provide that second white source on turn 2 when we already have a green source. So again, maybe we look here for additions. And I note that I did build this deck before Lord of the Rings came out, and I don't yet have a Delighted Halfling in there. Yeah, Delighted Halfling will only produce colorless mana on the turns that we are not casting our commander, but it's going to enable that early game plan much more reliably, and usually we're not that starved for colored mana on later turns, so it seems like a good add. Finally, the deck has the option to drop a turn 1 Serra Ascended and use that to trigger life gain on turn 2 with Trelasarra in play, which is certainly the most aggro this deck gets, but has the ceiling of 1 life gain trigger for each turn, while Soul Sisters have a much higher ceiling. Remember, we don't really care about gaining a lot of life. 6 life triggers Trelasarra the exact same as 1 life. But having lots and lots of triggers means that we get lots of chances to scry and pump Trelasarra. Now, once we have Trelasarra and a life gain engine going, we want to start digging, which means more life gain and more card draw. We're not on a lot of ramp, so we want to focus on 3 mana value or cheaper value end. The before deck list shows cards like Welcoming Vampire, Werewolf Pack Leader, and Occam Adversary, which all fit the bill, which usually stick around and trigger card draw on turn 4, and each turn they stick around thereafter. Our opponents are probably going to be putting their blockers in front of Trelasarra, not so much the 3/3 dinking in for some damage. In the initial build of the deck, our deck was running 31 or 32 lands plus 4 modal double-face cards, 2 which enter tapped before I started tweaking. One thing that can be very helpful when interrogating your mana curve is to look at a hypergeometric calculator. I'll have a link to one down in the description of this episode. If things go to plan, I'm going to have a starting hand of 7 cards, plus 3 cards for that turn 3 that I'm looking at, plus 1 scry, so I can bottom something to try to make sure that I hit my 3rd land on turn 3. Plugging this into the hypergeometric calculator, again, link is in the description, I see that I have about an 82% chance to curve out to 3 mana, 3 lands by turn 3, and then this drops off to about 74% chance to hit my 4th land on turn 4, again, assuming no additional card draw or life gain sources to scry. I'm going to give a real hard look to 4 mana value cards like Toski, Bearer of Secrets, and I am definitely rethinking 5 mana value cards like Warren Frostfang, looking instead for more cards which I can reliably cast on turn 3 for card advantage. I just don't think that early in the game I'm going to be swarming in with my Soul Sisters to try to draw additional cards. They're too valuable to risk in combat. So I want to look for other things that are going to draw me cards early. On the other hand, I really don't mind paying 5 for a card which puts my opponents on a clock quite so much, or doesn't necessarily need to come down on curve to be effective. So I don't mind my high end still existing, but I want to be very choosy about what cards I put in those 4, 5, and even 6 mana value slots. Another thing to keep in mind while we're doing this is that there are many different types of card advantage in the game, particularly when we have such fine control over the cards on top of our deck. So for card advantage, I'm also going to look at future side effects, or cards that let you play cards from the top of your library. Augur of Autumn is already a pretty decent card, the little 2/3 for 3 mana value that lets you play lands off the top of your library. Having Coven and 3 different powers on 3 different creatures is pretty easy for this deck. Our Soul Sisters have a power of 1, Augur of Autumn has a power of 2, and Trelasarra is almost always going to have a power of 3 or more. So Coven is almost always on, which means that Augur of Autumn will usually let us cast creatures off the top of our library too, which is going to be more than a third of our total deck. I'm also pretty fond of Courser of Kruphix and how it's performed so far, acting as a pseudo Soul Sister for landfall, while also giving us a way to clear lands off the top, and then just immediately netting us a scry with our commander to potentially see as many as 2 additional cards. I'm going to experiment with a card from Murders at Karlov Manor, Assemble the Players, as a 2 mana value, cheap future sight effect, as it lets us play creatures with a power of 2 or less off the top of our library, which is a full quarter of our deck. As I mentioned, I'm not too interested in the 4 mana value engines, so I'm going to pass on staples like Oracle of Moldiah, but I'm very willing to test Elvish Chorus, because not only does it let me play more than a third of the cards in my library as we can cast creatures off the top, but it then immediately spots us mana back when we can start casting right away, because it lets all of our creatures tap for mana of any color. I'm also looking at other ways to generate advantage, and in this case, Huntwood Shrieker from Duskmourn is one that I'm interested in. 1 green for a 3/3 beast, and whenever this thing attacks, Manifest Dread. Means, look at the top 2 cards of your library. You can put 1 in the graveyard, and you can put 1 into play manifested, so it's a 2/2 colorless with no name, no creature type. You can then pay 1 and a green to turn a creature face up, and remember, with Manifest Dread, it's got to be a creature on the other side, which I think our deck can pretty reliably hit between having such a high density of creatures and all the scrying. And of course, Manifest Dread means you can always just cast the creature for its normal cost to turn it face up at any time without using the stack. Finally, I'm also looking at the initiative as another source of advantage and testing Seasoned Dungeoneer, which not only gives us the initiative on ETP on a 4 mana value creature, but immediately makes any member of our party, which are warriors, wizards, rogues, and clerics, includes Trelasarra there at the end, they become unblockable with protection from creatures whenever you attack. This means this is another potential source of evasion for us in addition to being a source of advantage, which immediately nets us a basic land when it enters. I think the slot may go to something else. I would kind of like more Anthems in the deck, as being able to turn the corner and have all my creatures suddenly beating down and be a great way to alpha strike somebody out. So I have my eyes on a card from Foundation's Jumpstart. Koala, a Johnny's Pridemate, as this is another potential Anthem effect and a mana sink. I'm also considering replacing it with Speaker of the Heavens as a 1-drop with lifelink, which fits the bill of our ability to manipulate the top deck on turn 3 by swinging in on turn 2 to gain a life, and then on later turns, we can always just activate it as long as we're at 47 or more life to start creating 4/4 angels. It's a way to potentially overwhelm our opponents in the mid-game, and it could be interesting, I kind of look at it as a poor man's Ocelot Pride, which is another card I'm considering for that slot. As I went through the tweaking, I realized that I was not really tweaking anymore. It was more of a complete overhaul of the deck by the time I reached my interaction package. Because yes, in the before deck, flexible answers like Beast Within and its ilk are fantastic, but I felt like I could squeeze a lot more advantage out and added more redundancy by swapping them out for cards like Haywire Might, Caustic Caterpillar, and Qasali Pride Mage. This led to me thinking that maybe for my top end, I could swap out a token maker like Tendershoot Dryad and give a little more recursion with a card like Celestine the Living Saint, which, at the end step, allows us to get a creature with a mana value less than or equal to the amount of life we gain this turn directly back into play. Kind of like a Sun Titan effect, but a little bit cheaper, with flying, with lifelink, and potentially with a higher ceiling. I feel like the ceiling on life gain triggers is going to be lower in this, but the higher quality of bodies that I'm putting on the battlefield seems like it's worth it. Especially being able to get back a Soul Sister which was lost earlier, or even potentially a value engine that I was really relying on that got taken out, can be a great way to really get me back in the game. Decreasing the number of token producers that I was running led to the decision to swap out by invitation only as a one-sided sweeper, and to replace it with Dusk to Dawn, which could only serve as an emergency reset button, which, yeah, kills Trelasarra, but leaves most of my board intact. And I can then later get my whole board back out of the graveyard with the Aftermath side. Austere Command stays in because of how easily it can remove problematic cards while keeping my board intact, as most of our creatures are low mana value, and we are almost completely avoiding artifacts other than a handful. While looking at the interaction in the form of MDFCs from Modern Horizons 3, like Witch Enchanter and Bridgeworks Battle, also triggered me adding in Disciple of Freyles, which in the after deck I actually have in over Rishkar's Expertise, as this is another way for me to reload my hand if Trelasarra isn't getting the job done, but still offers more options in the early game to play untapped lands to get my early game plan going. Which meant that when my overhaul was done, I wound up with more lands in the deck than when I started, but also had more interaction and more value engines. Ultimately, what I thought was going to be some tweaking wound up being a wholesale teardown of the entire deck. The foundation is still the same, with the Soul Sisters package seeing the smallest change, and the rest of the deck changing more dramatically around it. Like, for example, I added in the new Hinterlands Sanctifier from Horizons Jumpstart. It's a Soul Sister that has 2 toughness, is a rabbit, and only triggers on your creatures entering, but it makes that early game plan a whole lot more consistent. A lot of the changes I made were pretty mild, some were fairly radical. Like, as I mentioned, I put Delighted Halfling in the list because Lord of the Rings came out since I built this deck and never got around to updating it to include Delighted Halfling. I also made sure to include some insurance cards, things like Ghostway and Eerie Interlude, 3 mana value white instants which allow me to exile my entire board and then have them return at the beginning of the next end step. They enter, allowing all those Soul Sister triggers to go off, allowing Trelasarra to be pumped back up, and allowing me to scry deep into my deck in response to somebody trying to wipe the board. I took these over something like Teferi's Protection or Heroic Intervention, as neither of those cards really did very much for the rest of my game plan and were much more reactive. And having my whole board phase out with Teferi's Protection protects me against a Rift, sure, but it means I wasn't getting any value off of all those creatures that my opponents were then dropping after the Rift. We want value. So that's the deck list. For anyone who's interested, both the before and after deck list links are in the description of this episode. And this is the deck that I will bring with me to events in 2025, as well as play it on stream, so be sure to keep an eye out for it. If you've enjoyed this or any of our other episodes, be sure to let us know about it. On YouTube, we're part of Commander Cookout Media Group. We're also on Twitter and Blue Sky as Gemstone Mine MTG, and you can send us an email, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.